Commanders involved in this historical event. These are all commanders who appeared throughout this operation. Bullet Operator Major General John B. Wogan, Commanding General, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Field Marshal Walter Model, Commander, Army Group B German. Bullet Operator General Matthew Ridgway, Commanding General, 18 Airborne Corps. Bullet Operator General Courtney Hodges, Commanding General, U.S. 1st Army. Bullet Operator General der Infanterie Gustav Adolf von Zongen, Commander, 15th Army German. Bullet Operator General der Infanterie Friedrich Kockling, Commander, LXXXI Corps German. Bullet Operator Colonel Carlton H. Russell, Combat Command A Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Colonel Harris M. Molaski, Combat Command B Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Captain O'Malley, Task Force Commander, C Company, 46th Tank Battalion. Time, 0430 hours. Date, April 10th, 1945. Location, Assembly area near Hanau, southern edge of the Ruhr Pocket, North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. Weather, cold spring morning, heavy overcast, intermittent rain. Temperature near freezing. Units involved. 13th Armored Division, U.S., attached to 18 Airborne Corps, opposing German forces from Army Group B including 15th Army, LXXXI Corps, and remnants of 14 divisions trapped in the Ruhr Pocket. The tanks of the 13th Armored Division sat idling in the pre-dawn darkness near Hanau on April 10, 1945. Their crews slumped inside the vehicles in various states of exhaustion after a 260-mile forced march that had brought them to the southern edge of the Ruhr Pocket. Scott, a soldier whose account would later be preserved in division records, sat on the cold ground beside his Sherman and tried to remember the last time he'd slept for more than 2 hours straight. It had been days. Maybe 3, maybe 4. Time blurred when you were constantly moving. Around him, other crew members huddled in whatever shelter they could find from the rain that had been falling intermittently since midnight, smoking cigarettes cupped in their hands to hide the glow, speaking in quiet voices about what waited for them inside the pocket. Everyone knew the numbers. Over 300,000 German soldiers trapped between converging American armies, squeezed into an area that was shrinking daily. The question wasn't whether the pocket would collapse. The question was how many people, American, German, civilian, would die before it did. Major General John B. Wogan stood in the command post established in a requisitioned German factory building in Hanau, studying maps under the light of kerosene lamps while his staff officers prepared movement orders for the dawn offensive. The 13th Armored Division had been attached to General Matthew Ridgway's 18 Airborne Corps specifically for this operation, tasked with driving north through the pocket's interior toward Bergisch-Gladbach and ultimately Duisburg, severing German communications and creating the chaos that would force mass surrenders. Wogan traced the planned route with his finger, calculating distances, identifying choke points where resistance might concentrate. At 0445, Colonel Carlton Russell entered the command post, rainwater dripping from his field jacket, and reported that Combat Command A was ready to move on order. "How are the men?" Wogan asked. Russell paused before answering. "Exhausted, sir. We've been moving for over a week with minimal rest. But they'll fight." Wogan nodded slowly. "They won't have to fight much longer. Intelligence says German resistance is collapsing faster than model can reorganize. We just need to maintain pressure." Russell's expression suggested he'd heard similar assessments before battles that turned into grinding slugfests, but he simply said, "Yes, sir," and left to rejoin his command. As dawn broke over Hanau around 0615, the weather remained miserable, cold rain, low clouds, visibility restricted to a few hundred meters. The 13th Armored Division began its advance northward in tactical columns, Shermans and half-tracks moving through muddy roads that had been torn up by weeks of military traffic. Captain O'Malley, commanding a task force from the 46th Tank Battalion, stood in his tank's turret despite the rain, needing the visibility even if it meant being soaked and freezing. His crew was quiet inside the vehicle, each man focused on a station. The driver navigating the treacherous road, the gunner scanning for threats through his optics, the loader sitting beside stacked ammunition, rounds that might kill them all if a German anti-tank gun scored a lucky hit. They passed through a small village. O'Malley never learned its name, where white sheets hung from windows, the traditional signal of surrender. Civilians watched from doorways as American armor rolled past. An elderly German woman stood in the rain holding a child's hand, her face expressionless. O'Malley wondered what she was thinking, watching foreign tanks occupy her country, her world ending in rain and diesel fumes and the metallic clank of tank treads on cobblestones. The first indication that this operation would be different from previous combat came around 0840, when Combat Command A encountered a German roadblock near the town of Siegburg, manned not by regular Wehrmacht troops, but by Volkssturm, old men and boys pressed into service with minimal training and inadequate weapons. O'Malley's task force halted approximately 400 meters from the position, while a forward observer called for artillery support. But before the fire mission could be executed, something unexpected happened. A German officer, elderly and wearing a Volkssturm armband, walked forward from the roadblock carrying a white flag. Colonel Russell, commanding from his position with the lead elements, radioed back to division. "We have a German officer approaching under white flag, requesting instructions." The response came quickly from Wogan's command post. "Accept surrender if offered. We don't have time for set-piece battles against militia." The German officer, speaking through an interpreter who was a German-American soldier from New York, explained that his unit, approximately 150 men, wished to surrender but needed assurance they wouldn't be shot by SS security detachments that Field Marshal Model had positioned throughout the pocket to prevent unauthorized capitulations. The surrender at Siegburg took less than 20 minutes to complete. The Volkssturm soldiers laid down their weapons, a mixture of obsolete rifles, hunting shotguns, and a few Panzerfaust, and assembled in the town square under the guard of a single American infantry platoon while the 13th Armored Division's advance continued. Scott, whose unit passed through Siegburg shortly after surrender, later recalled the scene. These weren't soldiers. They were grandfathers and kids, wearing armbands and carrying weapons they barely knew how to use. One old man was crying, kept saying something in German we couldn't understand. Our interpreter said he was apologizing for fighting, said he'd been forced to join or they'd shoot his family. What do you do with that? We gave him a cigarette and told him the war was over for him. It was a pattern that would repeat constantly over the following days. German units that surrendered not because they'd been defeated in battle, but because they'd simply decided that continued resistance served no rational purpose. If you're seeing how quickly organized armies can disintegrate when soldiers lose faith in their cause, hit that like button and subscribe. There's a lot more untold history about the war's final collapse coming your way. By late morning, around 10:45, the 13th Armored Division had advanced approximately 15 kilometers beyond Hanau and was approaching Bergisch Gladbach, a city of roughly 35,000 inhabitants that represented the next major objective. Intelligence reports indicated varying estimates of German defensive strength, anywhere from a few hundred demoralized militia to possibly several thousand regular troops with armor support. The uncertainty reflected the chaos within the Ruhr Pocket, where German command and control was breaking down so rapidly that even Field Marshal Model's headquarters didn't have accurate information about which units were still combat effective and which had dissolved through desertion or mass surrender. Colonel Russell radioed Major General Wogan at 10:52, approaching Bergisch Gladbach from the south. No contact yet, but expecting resistance in the urban area. Request permission to bypass if opposition is heavy. Wogan's response was immediate. Negative. We need that city to maintain operational tempo. Reduce it with minimum delay. You have priority for artillery and air support if needed. The assault on Bergisch Gladbach began just after noon when Combat Command A's lead elements entered the city's southern suburbs and immediately took fire from German positions in multi-story buildings overlooking the main approach routes. The fire was heavy initially, machine guns, Panzerfaust, some mortar rounds, but poorly coordinated, suggesting that defending forces lacked unified command or clear defensive plan. Captain O'Malley's task force was advancing along the western approach when his lead tank was hit by a Panzerfaust fire from a basement window approximately 30 meters distant. The shaped charge penetrated the Sherman side armor, and the tank began burning. O'Malley watched through binoculars as the crew bailed out, from men scrambling from hatches, one with his uniform on fire, all running for cover while German machine gun fire kicked up dirt around them. 3 made it to safety behind a stone wall. The 4th, the tank's driver, was hit while running and went down in the street. An infantry sergeant from the supporting platoon, a man whose name O'Malley never learned, ran into the open to drag the wounded driver to cover. German fire intensified, rounds impacting all around them. But the sergeant kept moving, got the driver behind cover, and started applying a tourniquet to a leg wound that was pumping blood onto the cobblestones. Inside Bergisch Gladbach, the fighting developed into a confused series of small unit actions as American infantry worked building by building, while tanks provided fire support from positions that minimized their exposure to close-range anti-tank weapons. A tank commander from the 24th Tank Battalion, observing from a hull-down position behind rubble, watched German soldiers retreating through the streets several blocks ahead. Some were moving in organized groups under officer leadership, conducting a fighting withdrawal. Others were simply running, discarding weapons and equipment, attempting to escape the advancing Americans. At 1334, the tank commander's gunner asked, "Do we engage the runners?" The commander hesitated, watching through binoculars as German soldiers fled northward. "No," he said finally. "Let them run. They're out to fight." It was a judgment call that would be repeated thousands of times over the next week. American soldiers deciding when to kill and when to let defeated enemies escape, navigating the ethical complexities of a collapsing war where the line between combatant and refugee became increasingly blurred. By mid-afternoon, around 1530, organized German resistance in Bergisch Gladbach had collapsed, with defending units either surrendering or withdrawing northward toward Cologne and the Rhine River crossings. The 13th Armored Division had captured approximately 1,400 German prisoners in the city, processed them through hastily established collection points, and continued advancing. Scott's unit moved through Bergisch Gladbach's center as the fighting wound down, passing German prisoners sitting in the rain under minimal guard, waiting for transportation to rear area camps. One prisoner, a young German soldier who couldn't have been more than 17, asked in broken English if the Americans had cigarettes. Scott gave him a pack of Lucky Strikes, and the German said, "Thank you. The war is finished, yes?" Scott nodded. "Yeah, kid, for you it's finished." The German smiled with visible relief, like a burden had been lifted. Scott later remembered thinking that the kid looked happier as a prisoner than most American soldiers looked in victory. The war had become that kind of absurdity, fighting for cities nobody wanted, killing enemies who wanted to surrender, victory measured in prisoners processed rather than territory captured. As darkness fell over Bergisch Gladbach on the evening of April 10th, Major General Wogan established his forward command post in a commandeered municipal building and reviewed the day's operations with his staff. The division had advanced over 20 kilometers, captured nearly 2,000 German prisoners, and suffered relatively light casualties, for killed, 17 wounded. But Wogan understood that the first day's success created expectations for continued rapid advances, and that maintaining operational tempo would require pushing exhausted soldiers beyond what any training manual recommended as sustainable. At 2045, General Ridgway contacted Wogan directly via radio from 18 Airborne Corps headquarters. "John, excellent work today. Intelligence indicates the pocket is fracturing faster than model can reorganize. I need you to maintain maximum pressure. Bypass strong points, accept mass surrenders, keep moving north. The faster we collapse this pocket, the fewer casualties on both sides." Wogan acknowledged the orders, then sat in silence for several minutes after transmission ended, staring at maps that showed the shrinking German perimeter and calculating how many more days the division could sustain this pace before exhaustion forced operational pauses that would allow German forces time to reconstitute defenses. The morning of April 11, 1945, arrived with weather that remained stubbornly miserable. Cold rain continuing to fall, temperatures hovering just above freezing, and fog that reduced visibility in some areas to less than 50 meters. Scott woke at first light after maybe 3 hours of sleep on the floor of a damaged German house in Bergisch Gladbach, his uniform still damp from the previous day's rain, his body aching from days of constant movement. Around him, other soldiers from his unit were performing the morning rituals of exhausted men preparing for another day of combat, checking weapons, eating cold rations because there was no time to heat anything, chain-smoking cigarettes while staring at nothing. A sergeant whose name Scott never recorded walked through the building, waking anyone still asleep, saying the same thing to each man. Get up. We move in 30 minutes. Today we take Leverkusen. Nobody asked questions or complained. They just gathered their equipment and moved toward their vehicles, muscle memory and discipline carrying them forward when enthusiasm and energy had been exhausted days earlier. Combat Command A resumed its northward advance at 0545 hours, pushing toward Leverkusen, a major industrial city on the Rhine's eastern bank directly across from Cologne. Captain O'Malley, whose task force had lost a tank the previous day in Bergisch Gladbach, led his remaining vehicles along rain-slicked roads that wound through increasingly urbanized terrain. At 0723, his column encountered a scene that would become common over the following days: a German military convoy, perhaps 20 vehicles, abandoned intact along the roadside with no sign of the soldiers who had been operating them. O'Malley halted his force and sent infantry to investigate. The vehicles still had fuel in their tanks. Weapons and equipment were stacked inside, personal belongings scattered across seats, but the soldiers had simply vanished. A lieutenant from the infantry company reported back. "Sir, looks like they just walked away. Left everything. Tracks lead off into those woods to the east." O'Malley considered pursuing, but decided against it. Let them go. They're deserters now, not soldiers. Marked the position for intelligence, and we continue to Leverkusen. It was a practical decision that reflected changing tactical priorities. The objective was collapsing German military capability, not hunting individual soldiers who had already quit fighting. The approach to Leverkusen brought the 13th Armored Division into contact with German forces that were conducting a more organized withdrawal than had been seen in previous engagements, suggesting that some units still maintained cohesion and leadership despite the pocket's general disintegration. Around 0915, 4 reconnaissance elements reported encountering a German rearguard position approximately 3 kilometers south of Leverkusen city center, with anti-tank guns and infantry positioned to cover the main approach routes. Colonel Russell, commanding Combat Command A from his position with the lead elements, radioed for artillery support and ordered his forces to deploy for a deliberate attack rather than attempting to push through prepared position. The 498th Field Artillery Battalion responded within minutes, shells beginning to impact around the German positions at 0928. But as the artillery barrage continued, something unexpected happened. At 0941, German soldiers began emerging from their positions carrying white flags, hands raised, walking toward American lines while artillery rounds continued falling around them. Russell immediately ordered ceasefire and watched through binoculars as approximately 150 German soldiers surrendered, their commander explaining through an interpreter that they'd been ordered to hold a position, but that the artillery bombardment had convinced them further resistance would accomplish nothing except their own deaths. By late morning, around 11:15, the 13th Armored Division was entering Leverkusen itself, finding a city that presented a chaotic mixture of combat, surrender, and civilian evacuation all occurring simultaneously across different districts. In the southern sectors, German soldiers were still firing from buildings and conducting organized resistance. In the central areas, white sheets hung from windows and groups of German troops were surrendering to advance American units. In the northern sections, German forces were withdrawing across temporary bridges over the Rhine, attempting to escape encirclement before American forces could seal off all crossing points. Colonel Harris Molaski, commanding Combat Command B on a parallel axis east of Russell's route, entered Leverkusen from the southeast and encountered a German battalion commander who approached under white flag requesting a meeting. The German officer, speaking through an interpreter, explained that he commanded approximately 600 soldiers who wished to surrender, but that SS security detachments were positioned in the city with orders to execute any officers who capitulated without authorization from Field Marshal Model's headquarters. Molaski's response was direct. "Bring your men to the city square in 1 hour. My soldiers will protect you from the SS. Anyone who interferes with the surrender will be dealt with as hostile combatants." The mass surrender at Leverkusen's central square beginning at 1230 hours on April 11th provided a vivid illustration of how rapidly the Ruhr Pocket's internal structure was collapsing. Over 800 German soldiers assembled in the square, laying down their weapons in organized piles, while American military police established a perimeter and began processing prisoners. Scott, whose unit was assigned to guard the prisoners temporarily, watched as German soldiers queued up for registration, many appearing relieved rather than defeated. One German sergeant, middle-aged and wearing faded insignia from the Eastern Front, spoke enough English to communicate with his guards. "How long is the war?" he asked Scott. "Maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month," Scott replied. The German nodded thoughtfully. "Good. I go home to my family. The war is stupid now. Hitler is crazy, and we all know it." Scott would later recall thinking that if German soldiers were openly criticizing Hitler to their American captors, then the ideological foundation supporting continued resistance had eroded even more completely than the military ones. The war wasn't ending because Germany had been defeated in one decisive battle. It was ending because enough individual German soldiers had decided, independently and collectively, that continuing the fight served no purpose except prolonging the inevitable. As afternoon progressed on April 11th, the tactical situation in Leverkusen became increasingly confused as American forces advanced through some sectors while German forces still held others, creating a fragmented battlefield where friendly and enemy troops were intermixed in ways that made conventional military operations nearly impossible. At 14:45, Captain O'Malley's task force encountered a situation that illustrated the absurdity. His lead tanks rounded a corner and came face to face with a German supply column moving in the opposite direction. For several seconds, both forces simply stared at each other, American and German soldiers equally surprised by the encounter. Then the German column commander, an officer in a staff car at the head of the convoy, stepped out of his vehicle with his hands raised and yelled something in German. An interpreter with O'Malley's force translated. He says his unit surrenders. He asks if we have food because his men haven't eaten in 2 days. O'Malley accepted the surrender of approximately 200 German soldiers and their vehicles, directed them to a collection point, and continued advancing. The entire interaction took less than 5 minutes and involved no shots fired. This was what collapse looked like in practice. Not dramatic final battles, but weary soldiers on both sides trying to navigate chaos while minimizing casualties. By nightfall on April 11th, Leverkusen was largely secured, though isolated pockets of German resistance continued in some districts and would require additional clearing operations over the following day. Major General Wogan moved his command post forward to a position in Leverkusen's southern sector and received updated operational orders from General Ridgway at 18 Airborne Corps. The orders reflected the accelerating pace of the pocket's disintegration. The 13th Armored Division was to continue its drive north toward Duisburg and Mettmann, bypassing any strong points that could be isolated and reduced later by following infantry, focusing entirely on maintaining momentum that prevented German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines. At 2015, Wogan gathered his senior commanders for a brief meeting in a damaged factory building that served as a temporary command post. Intelligence reports indicate that Model's command structure is fracturing, Wogan explained, pointing to maps that showed the shrinking German perimeter. Some units are surrendering en masse. Others are still fighting. Our job is to create enough pressure and chaos that the ones still fighting decide surrender is their best option. We maintain aggressive forward movement. We accept surrenders efficiently, and we avoid getting decisively engaged in urban combat that consumes time and casualties. Questions? There were no questions because the guidance was clear. Even if executing it would require judgment calls at every level about when to fight and when to accept surrender. The night of April 11 to 12 brought a development that accelerated the pocket's psychological collapse even faster than American military operations. German soldiers began deserting their units in large numbers, either attempting to reach American lines to surrender or simply going home if they lived within the shrinking pocket's boundaries. Sentries from the 13th Armored Division's forward positions reported constant activity throughout the night, groups of German soldiers approaching with white flags, hands raised, asking to be taken prisoner. By dawn on April 12th, division collection points held over 3,500 German prisoners, the majority captured during the previous 12 hours, and the number was increasing hourly as word spread among German units that Americans were accepting surrenders and treating prisoners in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. Scott, pulling guard duty at a prisoner collection point in a Leverkusen factory yard, spent the night processing German soldiers who arrived in groups ranging from 3 or 4 to over 50. One group that arrived around 0230 hours included an officer who explained through an interpreter that his entire company had decided collectively to surrender after their battalion commander disappeared. Communications with higher headquarters ceased, and supply deliveries stopped. "We are soldiers, not fanatics," the German officer said. "The war is lost. Why should more men die?" Scott had no answer to that question, so he simply directed the Germans to join the other prisoners and completed the processing paperwork that reduced human beings to statistics in morning reports. April 12 saw the operational tempo intensify as the 13th Armored Division drove deeper into the collapsing Ruhr Pocket, advancing beyond Leverkusen toward the industrial cities of the northern Ruhr, where Field Marshal Model was reportedly attempting to consolidate remaining forces for a final stand. But final stand implied coherent defensive planning, and the reality on the ground was chaos. Combat Command A, pushing north toward Ratingen and Mettmann, encountered German forces that varied from organized units conducting professional fighting withdrawals to supply columns that surrendered immediately to groups of deserters who had discarded weapons and were simply trying to avoid being killed in the war's final days. At 11:34, Colonel Russell reported capturing an entire German regimental headquarters near Ratingen. Over 40 staff officers and enlisted personnel who surrendered their command posts intact, complete with operational maps, communication logs, and intelligence files that documented the extent of Army Group B's disintegration. The captured regimental commander, speaking through an interpreter, explained that he received no orders from division headquarters for over 36 hours, that his regiment had lost contact with 2 of its 3 battalions, and that continuing to resist when the entire pocket was obviously collapsing struck him as criminal rather than heroic. As the sun set on April 12th, the 13th Armored Division had advanced another 18 kilometers, captured over 5,000 additional German prisoners, and suffered minimal casualties, 2 killed, 9 wounded, in a day of operations that demonstrated how complete the Ruhr Pocket's collapse had become. Major General Wogan, reviewing reports at his forward command post in Ratingen, realized that the division's role was transitioning from combat force to occupation authority faster than operational plans had anticipated. The challenge was no longer defeating German military resistance, but managing the administrative and logistical complexities of processing tens of thousands of prisoners while maintaining enough combat capability to deal with the SS units and fanatical holdouts who were still fighting. At 21:45, Wogan received a radio transmission from General Ridgway with news that would accelerate the final collapse. The eastern segment of the Ruhr Pocket was on the verge of surrender, with over 80,000 German soldiers preparing to lay down their weapons after their commanding general decided that further resistance was pointless. The psychological impact of that surrender on German forces in the western segment, where the 13th Armored Division was operating, would be immediate and decisive. Within 48 hours, the entire pocket would cease to exist as an organized military force, and over 300,000 German soldiers would become prisoners in what would be remembered as the largest mass surrender to Western forces in the entire war. The morning of April 13, 1945, began with news that fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the Ruhr Pocket. The eastern segment had surrendered en masse during the night, with over 80,000 German soldiers laying down their weapons after General der Panzertrupp Joseph Harp and General der Infanterie Friedrich Koechlin decided independently that Field Marshal Model's orders to fight to the last man constituted murder rather than military necessity. Word of the mass surrender spread to the western segment with remarkable speed, carried by German deserters, intercepted radio transmissions, and the simple logic that if 80,000 soldiers had been allowed to surrender peacefully, then perhaps survival was possible for those who made the same choice. Scott's unit, advancing north from Ratingen toward Mettmann at first light around 0615, encountered the immediate effects. Entire German companies approaching American lines with white flags, officers explaining through interpreters that they had heard about the Eastern Pocket surrender and wanted the same terms. One German captain, young and wearing Knight's Cross decorations from earlier fighting, approached Scott's position at 0747 with approximately 120 soldiers behind him. "We wish to surrender," he said in careful English. "You will treat us correctly, yes? Like soldiers, not criminals?" Scott, who had no authority to negotiate but understood the moment required reassurance, replied simply, "You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You'll get food, medical care, and eventually go home when this is over." The German captain nodded, turned to his men, and gave orders in German. They began stacking weapons in an organized pile, while American guards watched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. By mid-morning on April 13th, the 13th Armored Division was processing German surrenders faster than prisoners could be evacuated to rear area facilities, creating massive bottlenecks at collection points where thousands of German soldiers waited under minimal guard for transportation that couldn't arrive quickly enough to clear the backlog. At a collection point established in a factory complex in Mettmann, over 2,800 German prisoners were being guarded by fewer than 60 American soldiers, a ratio that would have been tactically insane if the prisoners had any inclination to resist or escape. But the war had drained away whatever fight remained in most German units, replaced by a weary acceptance that surrender meant survival, and survival meant eventually return to families and homes that had been waiting for years. Captain O'Malley, whose task force had been diverted from combat operations to assist with prisoner processing, walked to the factory yard observing German soldiers, sitting on the ground in the rain, waiting. An elderly Volkssturm soldier, perhaps 60 years old, was crying quietly. O'Malley asked an interpreter to find out why. The German explained through tears that he had received news 3 days earlier that his home in Duisburg had been destroyed in bombing, that he didn't know if his wife and daughter had survived, and that all he wanted was to go home and find them. O'Malley had no comfort to offer except the truth. "The war will be over soon. Then you can go look for them." The German nodded and continued crying. War's human cost wasn't always measured in casualties. Sometimes it was measured in old men crying in factory yards, separated from families they might never see again. The tactical situation throughout April 13th reflected the Ruhr Pocket's accelerating disintegration as German command and control collapsed completely, and individual units made independent decisions about surrender based on local circumstances rather than orders from field marshal models increasingly irrelevant headquarters. Combat Command B, pushing northeast toward Duisburg along routes that parallel the Rhine River, encountered a German defensive position near Heiligenhaus at 1,023 hours that appeared well prepared with anti-tank guns and infantry in fortified positions covering the approach roads. Colonel Molaski deployed his forces for assault, called for artillery support, and prepared for the kind of engagement that could consume hours and result in significant casualties. But before American forces could attack, something remarkable happened. At 10:41, a German officer emerged from the defensive position carrying a white flag and walked forward to meet American representatives. The officer, identified through his papers as Major Wilhelm Brenner, commanding an infantry battalion, explained that his unit had been ordered to hold the position by officers who had since disappeared, that he had no communications with higher headquarters, and that he saw no purpose in fighting when the entire pocket was obviously collapsing. He would surrender his battalion, approximately 440 soldiers, if Americans would guarantee they wouldn't be turned over to Soviet forces. Molaski, who had no authority over ultimate prisoner disposition, but understood that immediate surrender avoided casualties on both sides, agreed. The entire battalion surrendered at 10:56. Weapons were collected, and the advance continued without a shot being fired. By early afternoon on April 13th, forward elements of the 13th Armored Division were approaching Duisburg itself, the largest city remaining under German control in the western Ruhr Pocket, and the location where Field Marshal Model had reportedly relocated his headquarters after previous command posts had been threatened by American advances. Intelligence estimates suggested that Duisburg might be defended seriously, both because of Model's presence and because it represented the last major industrial center still in German hands. But as American forces entered Duisburg's southern suburbs around 1430, they found a city that was already dissolving into chaos. German soldiers withdrawing northward toward the Rhine, civilians attempting to flee combat zones, and isolated units that appeared to be fighting more from confusion than conviction. A tank commander from the 24th Tank Battalion, advancing through Duisburg's industrial districts, reported over radio at 1447. We're taking sporadic fire from buildings, but it stops when we return fire. German troops visible withdrawing north. Civilians everywhere, some waving white flags from windows. Situation confused, but resistance appears disorganized. It was an accurate assessment of a city where the war was ending not through climactic battle, but through exhausted collapse. The afternoon of April 13th brought an encounter that illustrated how completely Nazi Germany's ideological foundations had crumbled among ordinary soldiers. Scott's unit, conducting house-to-house clearing in Duisburg southern districts, entered a basement where approximately 30 German soldiers had taken shelter. The Americans expected resistance, but found instead soldiers who immediately raised their hands in surrender. One German soldier, speaking through an interpreter, explained their situation. They were from a supply unit that had been separated from their parent formation 3 days earlier. They had no communications with higher command. They had minimal ammunition and no food, and their officer had deserted during the night. "We are not Nazis," the German insisted. "We are just soldiers who want to go home. Hitler is finished. Germany is finished. Why should we die for nothing?" The question hung in the damp basement air while American and German soldiers looked at each other across a divide that was narrower than either side had imagined. War reduced to the essentials. Young men who wanted to survive, to return to families and lives that war had interrupted, to stop killing and being killed for causes that no longer made sense if they ever had. Scott accepted their surrender, directed them to a collection point, and continued clearing buildings. Later, he would struggle to explain to people back home what that moment had felt like, standing in a German basement accepting surrender from soldiers who looked as exhausted and scared as he felt. Everyone just wanted the war to be over. As dusk settled over Duisburg on April 13th, Major General Wogan received an unexpected visitor at his forward command post, a German staff officer sent by Field Marshal Model to discuss potential ceasefire terms. The officer, Oberst Franz Becker, according to division records, explained that Model was prepared to consider a general ceasefire if Americans would guarantee that surrendering German soldiers wouldn't be executed or turned over to Soviet forces for prosecution. Wogan, after consulting with General Ridgway at 18 Airborne Corps, responded that surrender terms were non-negotiable, unconditional surrender in accordance with Allied policy, but that all prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Convention standards and that American forces would protect surrendering soldiers from SS reprisals. The meeting ended at 18-12 hours without agreement, with Becker returning to Model's headquarters to relay American terms. But the meeting itself was significant because it indicated that even Model, one of Germany's most capable and fanatical commanders, was recognizing that continued resistance accomplished nothing except additional casualties. Intelligence officers analyzing the situation predicted that Model would either order a general surrender within 48 hours or commit suicide rather than face the dishonor of capitulation. Both predictions would prove accurate, though in an order they didn't anticipate. The night of April 13 to 14 saw the highest rate of German desertions yet recorded, with entire companies and battalions dissolving as soldiers abandoned positions and either surrendered to Americans or attempted to reach homes within the pocket's shrinking boundaries. Guards of the 13th Armored Division's forward positions reported processing over 1,400 German soldiers who approached American lines between dusk and dawn, most arriving in small groups, some alone, all with the same story. Their units had disintegrated, officers had disappeared, supplies had stopped arriving, and continuing the fight seemed pointless when 80,000 soldiers in the Eastern Pocket had surrendered peacefully. One German deserter, a teenage soldier who couldn't have been more than 16, arrived at an American checkpoint around 0240 hours on April 14th and told guards through an interpreter that his entire platoon had been wiped out by artillery 3 days earlier, that he'd been wandering through ruins trying to find other German units, and that he'd finally decided surrender was better than dying alone in a collapsing pocket. American medics treated minor wounds on his hands and face, gave him food and water, and directed him to a prisoner collection point. He fell asleep sitting on the ground before transportation arrived, too exhausted to care what happened next. War's end for him meant simply being allowed to stop fighting and sleep without fear of being killed. April 14th brought the tactical splitting of the Ruhr Pocket into two completely isolated segments as American forces from multiple divisions established firm contact along a north-south line, that severed the remaining German-held territory. Field Marshal Model's headquarters in Duisburg was now completely cut off from approximately half of the forces nominally under his command, making unified resistance impossible even if German soldiers had the will and capability to continue fighting. The 13th Armored Division, operating in the western segment where Model remained, accepted over 12,000 German surrenders on April 14th alone as the psychological impact of the Pocket's division combined with exhaustion, supply shortages, and the demonstrated futility of continued resistance to create mass capitulation. Scott's unit, which had been diverted entirely from combat operations to prisoner processing, established a temporary collection point in the Duisburg Sports Stadium where German soldiers were registered, searched, given medical screening, and held pending transportation to permanent facilities. Walking through the stadium at midday, Scott observed thousands of German prisoners sitting in the stands, many sleeping despite the noise and chaos, others talking quietly among themselves, a few writing letters they hoped would eventually reach families. It looked like refugees waiting at a train station, Scott would later recall, not like an army that had been defeated in battle. Because they hadn't really been defeated, they just stopped fighting because there was no point anymore. The final collapse of the western Ruhr Pocket occurred during April 15th to 18th as remaining German units surrendered in cascading waves that eventually totaled over 317,000 prisoners, making it the largest mass capitulation to Western forces during the entire war. Field Marshal Model never ordered the general surrender that might have saved lives by ending resistance sooner. Instead, he disappeared from his headquarters on April 17th and was found dead on April 21st in woods near Duisburg, having committed suicide rather than face capture or the responsibility of ordering Army Group B surrender. His death changed nothing about the outcome. German units were surrendering with or without authorization from higher command, but provided a symbolic end to Nazi Germany's military resistance in the West. The 13th Armored Division's role in collapsing the Pocket, while not solely responsible for the outcome, had been decisive in creating the momentum and psychological pressure that made mass surrender inevitable. In 8 days of operation from April 10th to 18th, the division had advanced over 100 kilometers through the Pocket's interior, accepted the surrender of tens of thousands of German soldiers, and demonstrated that aggressive operational tempo, combined with humane treatment of prisoners, could accelerate military collapse more effectively than prolonged combat. The human cost had been remarkably light compared to earlier operations. 23 American soldiers killed, 94 wounded during the 8-day period. German casualties were harder to calculate, but estimates suggested approximately 10,000 killed during the Pocket's reduction, most dying in the early days before mass surrenders began. The remaining 317,000 went into prisoner camps, survived the war, and eventually returned to help rebuild a Germany that would rise from defeat to become a peaceful, democratic nation. Sometimes the greatest military victories are measured not in enemies killed, but in enemies who chose to stop fighting, in lives saved on both sides, and in the possibility of reconciliation after hatred has exhausted itself. What does it mean when over 300,000 soldiers decide collectively that survival matters more than continued loyalty to a regime leading them toward annihilation? How does an army disintegrate not through military defeat in decisive battle, but through psychological collapse as individual soldiers make rational calculations about life versus death, duty versus survival? When examining the Ruhr Pocket's collapse in April 1945, what stands out is not the tactical brilliance of American operations, though those operations were professionally executed, but rather the human dimension of exhausted German soldiers choosing surrender over pointless sacrifice, and exhausted American soldiers accepting those surrenders while trying to maintain enough combat capability to deal with the fanatics who chose death over capitulation. The 13th Armored Division's contribution was creating the operational conditions that accelerated psychological collapse, aggressive advances that severed communications, humane treatment of prisoners that encouraged surrenders, and relentless pressure that prevented German forces from reconstituting defensive lines. But the deeper story is about the individual moments when German soldiers decided they'd had enough. The captain who surrendered his company rather than watch more men die, the teenage deserter who chose life over ideology, the regimental commander who concluded that following orders to fight to the last constituted murder rather than duty. Does history adequately honor the difficult choices made by soldiers on both sides during war's final collapse? when survival required abandoning codes of honor that demanded continued sacrifice. And what did those 317,000 German prisoners carry home after the war besides memories of defeat? What understand about the nature of war, about the relationship between soldiers and the regimes they serve, about the point at which duty ends and self-preservation becomes the only rational choice? These questions matter because they remind us that wars end not with dramatic final battles, but with exhausted human beings choosing to stop killing each other, and that sometimes the greatest courage is displayed not in fighting to the death, but in having the wisdom to recognize when fighting serves no purpose except prolonging suffering.